On this episode of the Athletic Potential Podcast, we will be discussing key things you can look for in your youth athletes in regards to predicting injuries. Welcome to the Athletic Potential Podcast, your place to come and get answers to your athletic development questions. We cover a range of topics, all related to helping you to achieve your athletic goals so that you can experience and enjoy the athletic career that you deserve. I am your host, Dr. Mike Matthews. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Athletic Potential Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mike Matthews, physical therapist and strength coach, and run Athletic Potential, which is predominantly a facility where we treat baseball, softball athletes, and a variety of other athletes. We do seem to treat a lot of throwers, and we are in that time of year where we seem to get a lot of questions about injuries. And if you know anything in regards to the time of year that we're in right now, which I hate to date the podcast, but we are heading into season, which means it's spring and everyone's out getting ready and throwing and all those type of things that are fun. Spring training's going on. This is also the time of year that we see the most injuries, unfortunately. And so we get a lot of questions right now in regards to, how to treat these injuries that happen in the spring, or how do we avoid these injuries that happen in the spring? I believe that was last podcast. And today's question is all geared on, well, how can I maybe even predict injuries based on just looking at my athletes, or if you're a coach, or if you're your parent, or even if you're the athlete itself, how is it that I can look at the way you move and different types of things that will help predict injury in the future? As nobody wants to get injured, because if you do get injured, then you got to spend time getting better and rehabbing and then getting back into your sport, and it's just no fun when you can't play. So anyways, that's the things we're going to be discussing today. And on today's episode, we will also be discussing some key little takeaways in regards to testing that you can do. Now, I will tell you this, and I'll preface this, and I'll even say it in the question when I'm answering the question, and that is there are many different ways to do this. And I just did a pretty substantial review of the literature, and to see if there was one really gold standard test or series of tests or questions or whatever, to see if we could find really what's out there in regards to more specific throwing injuries, that what's the best practice. And I can tell you right now, there really isn't one. There's definitely different types of things that you can do. You can look at questions and questionnaires. That seems to help predict some injuries. You look at movements and range of motions and strengths. We'll get into this in a minute. That will help predict injuries. But as of right now, in regards to the published research, there's no one full set standard. And I only bring that up because I know a lot of people have asked for that. They've asked, like, well, what's the best way to test? And I can tell you this from here at Athletic Potential, we have our own tests that we put all of our throwers through, and I'll discuss that when answering the question as well. But just know that what we have found in the research is that the more specific, the more detailed the examination and screening, not only what you're doing, but by who it's done. And it sounds like a shameless self-plug for us here at Athletic Potential, but let's just be honest, there's a reason we exist, and that is because injuries continue to happen. And we've also been able to help a lot of people stay away from injury. So that the more specific you can be and the more specialized the person performing the tests can interpret the data and also gather the data, the more likely you're going to develop a program to avoid injuries in the future. Now, one more key thing I want to say, you always hear these things about, hey, we're going to do these injury prevention programs. You'll hear me say injury reduction more than injury prevention, because we cannot necessarily prevent all injuries, but we can reduce the incidents in which they happen. And that is really the thing that we're going to talk about in our today's question. So a lot of preface to this, because I've already answered this question to clients in person, and almost everybody's come back and asked some similar follow-up questions. So I kind of want to address those. So, and I want to hit them in the beginning, because what we find is when people listen to the podcast, as the podcast continues to go on, it seems like less and less people make it to the end. And so I wanted to hit the most important part in the beginning with all of these prefaces to the question. So that being said, let's now get to the question. And today's question comes from Mark, and Mark asks, what should I be looking for in my youth players to know if they are at an increased risk of injury? Mark, you sound like a coach. Now, you may also be a parent, and I don't know which one, but either way, you ask a very specific question, and I want to make sure everybody hears this. What should I be looking for in my youth players to know if they are at an increased risk of injury? Now, for those that are listening that are no longer youth, whether you're an adult, maybe youth would still classify high school age, or if you're in a college or a college coach or something like that, and you're listening to this, just know that these factors actually do apply to the older age groups, with the exception of a few, which I think you'll understand which ones those are. Okay. And so just know that these factors do play further away from the youth, but I'm going to be answering this question because Mark asked it for youth. I'm going to be answering specific to youth. Now, to identify and to be very clear, youth is in the research that we're talking about here, youth is 17.2 years of age and younger. And younger, I believe at the bottom end of this was around 9 years old. Okay. I don't have the exact number on the bottom end of it, but I do know that it was not, I think it was not lower than 9. I don't think we saw, the research didn't look at anybody like 8 or 7 year olds. Okay. And so just know that, so when we talk about these youth, that includes most everybody that's in high school and playing, youth sports, youth baseball. So Mark, this is a great question. This is something that we are constantly looking at here at Athletic Potential. We are constantly researching. We're constantly looking for a better way to identify these, what we call in the research world, risk factors that will then, show us as the clinician or the rehab specialist or the movement specialist to be like, hey, this is not necessarily a good thing. We see this. We know that this kid's probably going to be an increased risk of injury. We need to address it. Now, I'm going to cover this, and it'll go fairly quickly, but just know that there are probably, dissertations on each one of these. There's research articles, multiple research articles on each one of these, and just know that I'm giving you the summation of all of that because I've read most of them. I saved you a massive amount of dull reading, just so you know. But the idea is I'm trying to bring it into a summary for all of you. So just know that everything we're covering here is backed by research. There's good data on as well in regards to measurements and all that kind of stuff. And just know that I'm trying to give you not really like the most specific thing in the world that I can, because you got to measure it the correct way. You got to do this kind of stuff. I'm trying to give Mark, you as a way as a parent or a coach who doesn't have all these sophisticated ways to measure or to test. I'm trying to give you an on-field or in-home version of this so that you can look at your athlete and then decide maybe or maybe not. Now, that being said, let me start with this. Mark, I'm going to have you grade your youth athletes or youth players, as you put it, in a certain way. Okay. And you can change this if you want to, but this is kind of how I would want you to do it. Now, we're going to use like a traffic light analogy. Okay. So in traffic lights, there's 3 lights, 3 different colors of light. So there's red, there's yellow, and there's green. Okay. And we all kind of know green means go, everybody proceed. Yellow means we need to proceed with caution or slow down, or a change is going to occur or could occur. We need to consider it happening. Red means stop. Okay. Now, I think the best way to measure this, Mark, is really to try and classify your youth players into one of those 3 categories. And the reason is because it really identifies who really should be seen by a rehab specialist, somebody like us at Athletic Potential or someone like us, so that we can really get to the heart of what's going on, so that we can really decrease or reduce the incidence of injury in that player. Yellow would mean also probably needs to be seen and screened more thoroughly, so make sure that they are yellow, they're not a red, or maybe even to screen them out of being yellow and into a green. Or maybe they're yellow and there's some things that also need to be addressed and identified. Now, green doesn't mean they're not at increased risk. It just means they didn't fit the criteria for this test. So let me walk you through what I think is a good idea. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to cover in a little bit more detail the tests that we use here at Athletic Potential, how we do it, and what it looks like for us. And then I'm going to give you the home version. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. So one of the first things that we look for when a player comes in is range of motion. Okay. Now, we can get very specific on this. As a matter of fact, there's very specific ways to measure this. Just so you know, if you go to a clinician or someone else and they measure you, it really depends on how they measure you, whether or not that measure really tells you anything. You can be measured by someone and they take your arm and they wrench it all the way back, or they don't even wrench it back, or they just look at it and they say, hey, reach back, and they measure it. Depending on what position you're in, how you are holding it, how they are holding it, and what device they are using to measure will determine how accurate that measurement is and whether or not it is actually worth anything, because the research has been done and the research was measured very specifically and in very specific ways by very specific people. That's why we do things very specifically here at Athletic Potential, so we can use this mountain of data that exists out there to determine if our players are at an increased risk. Now, Mark, you're not going to have that. So we'll get to that. Okay, there's three main measures in the shoulder that we look at. First one is external rotation. That's layback. Okay, that's your ability for your arm to go backwards. Those that are watching this on video, you'll see I'm just reaching my arm backwards. It looks like, someone's about ready to throw a ball. Okay, that's external rotation, layback. We measure that. Then we measure internal rotation. It's your ability to take your arm down and forward. Okay, so think ball release. Okay, not full follow through, but you can see, if you're watching the video, it's just rotation coming down. Okay, by far the most mismeasured, misinterpreted, and really the most misdiagnosed issues we've seen in baseball throwers has been poor internal rotation measurement, interpretation. It's a mess, and there's a lot of things that go into this. Okay, we can talk about throwing with open growth plates and how it affects different measurements and those type of things, but it's a little bit much for one podcast. And so, Mark, we measure external rotation, we measure internal rotation, and we measure shoulder flexion. That's your ability to take your arm straight up over your head, and we measure that as well. What we know in the research is that based on if you have differences of so many degrees in these range of motions, you are at an increased risk of potential elbow or shoulder injury. Okay, and that exists from the youth level. They've measured this in youth all the way up to the professional level. So this is a pretty important measurement and a pretty important thing to look at, and is one that we look at with every single one of our clients to make sure that they fall within what we consider a normal range. Let me just tell you this. Most baseball players, even the professionals, the elites, they fall within a normal range, but no one is exactly the same. Okay. And so don't take your best player in your team and be like, that is ideal, and then measure everybody off of that. Everybody's got a little different body and makeup and structuring, and it just doesn't quite work like that. Okay. So we measure rotation. Now, Mark, the best way to measure this, okay, and this is the quick measure. Okay. So all my clinician buddies out there that are listening to this going, oh my gosh, that's really not that accurate. The answer is, you're right, it's not, but it's somewhere to start for someone who can do it on the field. Okay. So, and for those that are not watching, I'm going to do my very best to describe this. I'm not good at describing. Okay. Charades was never my strong suit, so I apologize in advance. Now, well, I'll do my best. If you can watch it, great. If you can't, we'll get to it. So what you're going to do is take both arms, you're going to pull them up in a 90-90 position. Okay. Goalpost, whatever you want to call it. You're basically going to try and take both arms and lay them into layback, as far back as they're going to go. What you want to see is that the throwing side goes just a little bit further than the non-throwing side. If you don't see that, meaning that the throwing side is about the same or less than the non-throwing side, that right there is a yellow or red flag for me. You should see their throwing side go back further than their non-throwing side. If you don't see it, problem. Okay, so just mark that down. Bam, problem. And I'll be honest, if you see that in an athlete, you got to ask them, hey, does that hurt? And if they say yes, you're in the pain category, you need to go see somebody. Like it's there's something weird, there's something going on in the shoulder. Just go to somebody and have them look at it. It will be 100% worth your time, money, the cost. It's all worth it. Okay, because you're going to solve so many problems by going to a qualified professional at that point. Okay, so that's test number one. That's layback test. Make sure the throwing side is going back further than the non-throwing side. Okay, that's the first test. Okay. The second test in regards to range of motion, you're going to take both hands. You're going to put them behind your lower back. Nobody can see this. Even on the video, you can't see this. You're going to put them on your lower back. And then you're going to have your players stand as tall as they possibly can and kind of get big chested, like push their chest out. What you're looking for is the elbows to stay relatively the same. You shouldn't see one elbow like kicking out to the side or like them leaning or anything like that. If you see one elbow that's pointing like straight back, that's not a good sign. So all you're looking for is about elbows about the same. They don't have to be perfect. Okay. That's not how this works. They just need to be close. If they're close, you're good. If they're way off, you're not good. Again, same speech I just gave on layback. Okay. So that's 2 tests in regards to shoulder range of motion. Okay. Layback, internal rotation, or hands behind your back. Okay. The third, what I like to do is I like to have all the kids raise their arms above their head. Okay, as high as they can go, keeping their bodies nice and straight up against a wall. When you do this against a wall, it doesn't allow the cheaters to cheat. Okay, so you're going to have them up against a wall. You're going to have them raise both arms above their head. What you're hoping for is that both arms make it about the same distance from the wall, or they all make it to the wall. What you don't want to see is one arm make it to the wall and the other one not. Okay, those watching can see that. Now, other thing may happen is that they both may not make it to the wall, but you don't want to see the throwing side. You don't want to see the throwing side less than the non-throwing side. Okay. If you see the throwing side less than the non-throwing side, that's a problem. You want to have them looked at. Okay. That's a predictor of injury. Okay. So those 3 in regards to range of motion are probably the 3 I would tell you to do, Mark, and those are very simple to do. You can do that in under 10 seconds and have a very good idea if there's something really wonky going on, and if there is, go get it looked at. Okay, so range of motion is the first thing we look at. Now in the clinic, we measure all of this. We measure it, we put numbers on it, and then we go through it, and we look at differences side to side, and we really get crazy on it in regards to accuracy and what it should be. We get really nuts on it. And I can tell you right now, it has saved, I imagine it has saved a lot of different careers and avoided a lot of surgeries by us identifying, and it doesn't even have to be us, but it's by clinicians who know how to measure this, identifying these range of motions and not allowing players to continue to throw with these problems. If you continue to throw with these problems, you'll probably get away with it for a certain amount of time, but then one of 2 things will likely happen. One, your elbow is going to get really painful and sore, or you may even tear, or your shoulder is going to get really painful and sore, or you may even cause some tearing or damage inside of the shoulder. Okay. So know those are the case. Those aren't the only 2 things that can happen, but they are most likely going to happen if you have those things. All right. So those are the tests. Mark, I hope you remember that. I'll try to remember to do a summary at the end of all of this, but realistically, I will probably not remember all of it. So, but that's why we record it, and you can go back and watch it. So, second thing. So we were talking about range of motion. Second thing, strength. Okay. Now, in clinic or in here at Athletic Potential, we're using devices, and those that are watching, hopefully I can get this thing off without knocking all my setup down. We use devices like this thing right here. It's called a tensiometer. Okay. What it is we pull on this and it records, sends a feedback or a measurement over to our either iPad or laptop, and it tells us exactly how many kilograms or pounds of force is being pulled through that. Okay. We use that to measure. We've used other things in like what we call handheld dynamometers. You push against you and it gives you a reading and it kicks it back out. Okay. And we do have some availability with some force plates as well. So those help us a lot. And that allows us to really get very, very specific on how strong somebody is. Okay. Now, I can tell you right now, strength is a very difficult thing to really measure or to really understand how strong somebody is in a non-clinical setting, meaning you don't have machines like this. Okay. We have this thing in the PT world called manual muscle tests. Okay. And realistically, Mark, this is what you're going to do on the field. It is by far the best. And I tell everybody, and my student, John gets another mention in the podcast. Look, when I taught John, we were talking about manual muscle tests. I said, what are we testing with this? And his answer, which is appropriate, is strength. And I said, okay, but not really, because what we're really measuring is to see if there's any weakness. It's really a test to see if there's a presence of weakness in whatever we're testing. Because if we can't really measure strength. All we can measure that there is no weakness. So, Mark, you're going to measure to see if there's weakness. This is something everybody can do. And all you got to do is just a couple different tests. And we're going to mainly use the arm, okay? And there'll be one test that we use for general strength, or a lot of times people look at it as a core strength test, okay? So, Mark, you're going to do a couple things with your athletes. What you're going to do is you're going to have them stand nice and tall, okay? Feet shoulder width, so they got a good base. They're going to take both hands. They're going to reach forward like they're Frankenstein. Okay, so arms straight ahead, forward. You're going to then take your hands, put them on top of their hands, and push down. And what you're looking for is this. You're looking for symmetry. As you push down, they can hold that position with equal amounts of strength. If one is just getting dominated over the other, you have a strength asymmetry or strength impairment. That's a problem. Okay, and so I'm not a fan of that. I don't want to see strength impairments, but they do exist. So you're going to hold your arms out straight like in Frankenstein. You're going to push their hands down to see if there's a strength impairment. Now, in that exact same position, you're going to hold their arms out. And instead of pushing their hands or arms down, you're going to push their hands together like you're trying to make them clap like a seal, okay? And so you're going to try and push their hands together, and you're measuring the exact same thing. Hey, can they hold their arms at equal strength on both sides? If they can, great. If they can't, then that's a problem. Okay. The next thing you do is now they're going to hold their arms at their side like your Rock'em Sock'em robots. For those that are too young for that, I apologize. Just arms at the side, kind of like gunslinger position. Okay. You're going to hold your arms at your side, and you're going to try and push their hands together. Okay. This is rotation. Now, again, same thing, looking for symmetry of strength. Okay. So if you can do that, if they have good symmetry of strength, then they're good. If they don't, that's a problem. Okay. Obviously, by the way, if they ever have pain during these tests, this testing, that is not a good sign. Okay. Typically, pain is almost always a red on any of the testing. So if someone has pain, it's automatic red. And remember, red means referral. Okay. So you want to get them to somebody who can help you out. Okay. So, and then the last test you're going to do, so you've got Frankenstein pushing down, Frankenstein pushing in, and then you've got gunslinger position, trying to push the hands together. Once you are done with that, I'm going to have you then have them get into a push-up position. Okay, so plank on hands, whatever it is, so they're in the top part of the push-up position, and their job is to hold it as for long as possible. For those that listen to past podcasts, you know this is the 2-minute plank test. Okay, so I really like the 2-minute plank test for a lot of different reasons. It tells me a lot. Now, what you're looking for is that they can actually get in the correct plank position. You can coach them and put them there. If you don't know what it is, just put them what you think's best, and then start watching them. The key is, as you're starting to watch them, you're going to look for what fails first. Is it the shoulder blades start to like really suck together and they dip? Does their back arch? Do their hips start getting closer to the ground? You're looking for what fails first. And whatever fails first, that's something you want to make note of. Okay. Now this one's hard to grade in like on that green, yellow, and red scale, but I can tell you right now, if they can't get into position, it's an automatic yellow and borderline red. That just usually means that their strength to weight ratio is not good. Okay, which is an increased risk of injury. So if they can get in position, hold it for a decent amount of times, typically a yellow to a green. If they rock it, they don't have to make 2 minutes, by the way. Youth rarely make 2 minutes. But if they look good for a certain amount of time, usually I give them a green, even if they don't make 2 minutes. Okay, so 4 tests in regards to strength. Frankenstein's pushing their arms down. Frankenstein's pushing their hands together. Gunslinger position, and then push their hands together if they can't, and have them hold it. And then 2-minute plank test, see how long they can go and see what fails first. Okay, so those are the 2 things, 2 areas. So range of motion and strength that are probably one of the easier ways to test on field. Okay, now the next part of this actually has really nothing to do with their physical testing. People will be like, well, what about touching their toes? And what about their ability to do a squat and those kind of things? I can tell you right now, it is really all over the place in regards to the research about whether or not those are actually predictive at all in regards to injury rates. The older the youth, meaning we're getting to high schools, 15, 16, 17, 18, I can tell you from anecdotal research that I have done those that are unable to perform a normal good squat and a normal good hinge seem to be a slightly increased risk of injury, because I don't think they can load the kinetic chain very well. They don't use their bodies very well to throw. Okay. So just know maybe that you can look at that, but realistically, there's some diagnostic value. It just means that there's an inefficiency, and any inefficiency is potentially problematic in regards to injury. Okay. But just know that it's not really a slam dunk. And I'm trying to give you some slam dunk stuff here, Mark, that way you can grade your athletes quickly and understand who needs referral, who needs some just, good attention and more coaching, and who you probably don't need to worry about too much. Okay. Now, remember, we talked about two things so far: range of motion and strength. The next one's, somebody coined the term attributes. These are factors, but realistically, there's a list of things here. Okay. Now you can write them down as I go through. Okay. And if you can remember these, great. Just know that these all are associated based on surveys and research and other data that they have pulled from other sources, which is typically like databases in regards to injury. Okay. About what will either increase or decrease the injury rate in players. Now, everything I'm going to talk about will increase the risk of injury in your youth athletes. Okay. Now, remember, this is more specific to throwers, but to be honest, I think a lot of these are probably consistent across all sports. But here we go. All right. First one, they specialize in a sport before the age. Well, there's no even age. I looked this up. Sorry, I almost totally threw out bad data at you. I just read the sports specialization study, and they did a survey, and they found that those that specialized before the age of 13, or maybe it was 14, I think it was 13, were at an increased risk of injury. I can tell you right now, if they specialize in sport, if they're only playing one sport at the moment, meaning that they're not, when the off season comes for baseball, they're not playing football, they're not playing hockey, they're not playing something else, they're only playing one sport, that's an increased risk of injury. Okay. That's usually baseball, right? So we're talking about baseball here. If they're only playing baseball and they're not playing any other sports during the off seasons, then they are automatically at an increased risk of injury. Okay. These guys are yellows. Like for me, that's a yellow category automatically. Okay. Cause now you've got to really monitor fatigue and everything else. We'll get into that. Sorry. Okay. First one, that they're a single sport specialized athlete. They're not playing any other sports. Okay. Second, they're in a growth phase. You know, these kids, if you know your team and you've been around them, or these are obviously your kids, you're going to know whether they're in a growth phase or not. If they are in a growth phase, they're automatically at an increased risk of injury, and you just got to monitor their activity and their throwing, and generally just have to monitor them a little bit more. These guys are yellows to greens, okay, for me, because this is when they get a little bit bigger and all of a sudden they realize they can throw a little harder or they can hit it a little bit harder. And so they do it more and more, but they're in a growth phase, which means the muscles and the bones are not at the same speed. The bones are growing faster. The muscles can keep up, and we see a little bit more stress go through bone. This is where your little leaguer's elbow, little leaguer's shoulders comes in, and some other injuries that we see. Okay. So if they're in the middle of growth phase, it doesn't mean they can't play. It just means you need to monitor it a little bit more. Okay. In regards to other physical attributes, we talk about they're in a growth phase. If they're already fairly tall, okay, so if you have got a 13-year-old that's 6 foot, 5'8", or 5'9", 5'10", just a big tall kid, they are automatically at risk, or more at risk of an injury than those that are not. Now, it doesn't mean being short is a good thing. Okay, I apologize. I said this backwards. If you have a shorter athlete who's throwing harder, they might be more likely to an increase of risk of injury. If they're taller, there's a slight decrease in risk of injury. My apologies. I totally botched that one. As you can tell, I probably read a little too much research all at one time. Okay. So shorter, throwing harder, slight increased risk of injury. Taller, typically they're okay, so long as they're not in the growth phase. Okay. The next one was consistency of mechanics. If they are inconsistent in their throwing mechanics, they are automatically at increased risk of injury. I kind of feel like this is like that makes a lot of sense. But you look at the way kids throw, and they're not coached out of it a lot of times, or they're being successful, but their mechanics are all over the place. it's a good idea to really look at these kids and get their mechanics very consistent, because what happens is, in order to be successful, they're putting stresses on different areas that may increase that risk of potentially developing pain or other problems in elbow and shoulders and other places, and low back, those kind of things. Okay, so mechanical inconsistency is an increased risk of injury in the future. And then general fatigue. If you got a kid who he looks tired, he acts tired, he is tired, right? He's not sleeping enough, those kind of things. Those kids that just seem generally fatigued, okay, these are the kids that are playing, maybe even playing like multiple different teams in baseball. They get done with a tournament, and they show up to your tournament, with maybe 1 day of rest, and you look at them, they're just not moving as fast. These kids are at an increased risk of injury for sure. Okay. So just know that. Now I'm going to run through these really quick again. And I apologize again for the confusion about the tall part, but let me see if I can get it straight this time. So these are the attributes. Okay. If they are a single sport specialized athlete, they're an increased risk of injury. Okay. If they're in the middle of a growth phase, they're an increased risk of injury. If they are if they are shorter and throwing harder, they're an increased risk of injury. If their mechanics are inconsistent, increased risk of injury. And if they are fatigued, generally fatigued, they are an increased risk of injury. Now, one other thing I may want to add to this is, if you've got a kid who throws pretty hard and he's a youth player, he's more likely to be at an increased risk of injury. And if he throws more fastballs more often, he's also at an increased risk of injury. Those are less powerful in regards to how do you want to say it? It's less powerful in regards to the potential chance of injury, but it does look like it increases the risk of injury if they're throwing harder, like higher velos, and throwing fastballs more often. Okay. Now, everybody always, well, what about curveball? Curveballs are bad for the arm and all this kind of stuff. They found in the research that the curveball is no more stressful than a fastball. And so just know that the kids that seem to get injured more are the kids that throw harder and throw fastballs more often. And they're also because the kids that typically play more, because they're throwing harder and they're better, right? So just know that all plays a risk, and that plays a role in the risk, and that plays into fatigue. So, all right, as a review, Mark, here we go. First, range of motion. Okay. You're going to look at 3 different things. You're going to look at layback symmetry, arms going back. You're going to look at behind their back, elbow symmetry. You're going to then also look at shoulder flexion symmetry, arms up overhead. Okay. Then you're going to look at strength. You're going to do Frankenstein's, where you're going to push their hands straight down and see if they have strength symmetry. You're going to go Frankenstein's, but pushing their hands together to see if they have strength symmetry. And then you're going to go gunslinger position, hands together, or elbows against their sides, elbows bent at 90, push their hands together, see if they have symmetry. Then you're going to do a 2-minute plank and see which fails first. Okay. And then you're going to look at these attributes that we just covered. That is, they're only playing one sport, baseball. They're in the middle of a growth phase. They are shorter and throwing harder. They are mechanically inconsistent, and they're generally fatigued. And maybe they throw harder and they throw more fastballs than any other, most pitches. Okay. So those things right there. Now I can tell you this, we talked about trying to grade your athletes into a green, yellow, and red. This gets a little bit difficult. Okay. But I can tell you this, if you go through all 3 of these and say your athlete does fine on the range of motion, so they're green on range of motion, okay, meaning they have a little bit more external rotation on their throwing side, they've got symmetry in the elbows, and their flexion looks about the same. They're green on range of motion. They test strength. They're symmetrical in regards to the strength, and all the tests, and their 2-minute plank seems to be okay. They are now green, okay, in regards to strength. And then you go to the attributes and say they have 2 attributes, so they're in the middle of growth phase and their mechanics are inconsistent, but the rest are fine. You're looking at an athlete who really is green. Okay. Now it gets kind of fuzzy here, but just so you know, we talked about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 attributes, 5 attributes with maybe a 6. Okay. The 6 haven't used yet. I just keep an eye on those kids. Right. But 6. Okay. Of those 5 attributes. My gosh, it's been bad today, hasn't it? Sorry, guys. Hang with me. 5 attributes. Okay. If you have 3 of the 5, that's a yellow. If you have 4 of the 5, it's now a red. Okay. Now, you look at this, and so say this athlete only had 1. That's a green. He's green. He is good to go, or even she. Okay. Now we go back. Say their range of motion's off somewhere. So if you have external rotations off, but internal rotation or hands behind your back and flexion are good, that's a yellow. So of the three, if one is off, it's an automatic yellow. If two are off, it's a red. Okay. If pain exists in any of this, it's a red, period. Okay. So one off, yellow, two off, red. Okay. And that's the same way with strength. If they have asymmetry in one, it's a yellow. If they have asymmetry in two, it's a red. Okay. So Mark, I hope this helps. I think what may actually help is just a quick little overview. We did this very similar test with somebody at the field the other day. And let me just walk you through it. So a kid comes up to me, I talk to him. The kid is 14 years old. He's not super short, not super tall, but he's got big old feet, and you can tell he's just a newborn giraffe type scenario. Okay. So I look at this kid and I go, okay, hey, I'm going to do a couple quick tests with you. We just need to look at this. So first thing I did is had him arms up, reach back. Both arms were symmetrical, slightly more on his throwing side. Good. I looked at hands behind his back, looked at his elbow symmetry. Both good. Okay. And then had shoulder flexion, looked up. Shoulder was a little off on one side. Okay. So I was like, okay, yellow. So we've got a yellow on range of motion right now. I did his strength. All three of the tests. So pushing down, pushing in, no pain, all symmetrical. He got a green on strength. Okay. So we got a yellow and we got a green. Then I went to his attributes. He was playing two sports. He played football in the fall, played baseball in the spring. So doesn't get that one. He was in the middle of a growth phase, both because I could tell because of the way he was and because his mom confirmed it. Okay. So we've got one. Okay. And then we looked at him. He was in that mid-height range. He kind of threw harder. And so I was kind of debating on whether he was short and threw hard. But he was short until this growth phase. So I looked at it from the standpoint of that he classified as shorter and threw harder. So that's 2. Okay. I wasn't able to see him pitch, but I did see a video of him pitching. His mechanics were inconsistent, pretty inconsistent. So now we're to 3 out of 5. Okay. Right. And then I looked at this kid and I was like, well, how do you feel? Like, you good? And you could tell the kid just move and slow. And I'm like, tell me about yesterday. Tell me what you're doing. The kid I just laid around. I'm like, do you feel tired? He's like, yeah, I'm pretty tired. Bam, 4. He got a red in attributes. Okay. So now I just gave you a kind of a crazy scenario. Range of motion, green. Strength, yellow. Attributes, red. So what does he end up as? Right? Let me make it very simple. If you have a kid who's in the red and any one of these attributes or any one of these things, those 3 things, range of motion, strength, and attributes, they're a red. They need to be looked at. Something needs to be done. These kids are at risk. Okay? Maybe he just needs to sleep. I don't know, but you need someone to identify the main area that needs to be improved upon and make a change. Okay? Now, say in attributes he was a yellow. That would mean I had a green, a yellow, and a yellow. He's now a yellow, which means I'm probably going to be having, I'd be looking at fatigues. I'd be looking at, make sure he's growing, make sure he has enough rest in between his throwing, like his pitching, if he's a pitcher, those kind of things. Okay. So then, but now let's say we got a range of motions are green, strength a yellow, attributes are a green. What is he now? He's a yellow. Okay. If you're a green, you have to be all greens. 1 yellow equals a yellow, 2 yellows equals a yellow, 1 red equals a red. Okay. See how this works? It's not the most perfect thing in the world, but hey, you can do this on your own, Mark. You can take your youth athletes through it. If you have kids that are red, let's figure out what's going on with them. I can tell you right now, taking the time and effort to figure it out will help them stay on the field. And if you're a coach, that helps you as a coach, but realistically helps that player stay healthy and have a longer and a better career. So, hey, I appreciate everybody listening to this podcast. This is a pretty extensive question with a longer answer, and thanks for staying with me on it. Hopefully it's a tool that we can see used. I can tell you right now, and I'd probably even say 4 to 5 months from now, I'm probably going to come back and tell you to change it because I think we're going to have new evidence. There's so much stuff that's coming out, but based on what I've seen, which probably isn't the most extensive review, I probably could have done a review for a solid week and still come up with some new things. I can tell you right now that this is kind of the things that I look for right now to try and make sure our athletes are staying healthy. And if we see that, and this nice quick test, if we see that, get him into somebody, red means referral. Like, gotta go. And let's get somebody to look at them, identify some things. It may just be as simple as, rest strategies or even recovery strategies or just basic strength and range of motion or stretching, those kind of things. It may just be that easy to keep this athlete on the field of play for as long as possible. So, hey, I appreciate everybody coming out to the podcast. Please recommend to your friends the podcast. If you have questions, please ask questions. We want to answer them. We want to get as much good information as we can out there. We appreciate you taking the time. Rate and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And if you do have questions, again, ask those questions. This is a podcast-driven or question-driven podcast. There we go. Okay. And we need your questions to keep it going. And I appreciate you guys taking the time, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks. Hey everybody, I just want to say thank you for listening to the Athletic Potential Podcast. If you do have questions for the podcast, please visit the website, www.athletic-potential.com/podcast. You'll find a button there to ask your question. Please input your information and your question, and we will answer any and all questions we get. And thank you again for listening. If you do get a chance, please rate and review the podcast. And until next time, thanks.